word hit me before I even processed who had said it. Liability. My father said it the way he said most things. Flat. Certain. Like he was reading from a manual. We were standing in the middle of the 4th of July barbecue at my uncle's place in Tulsa. Paper plates and plastic cups everywhere. Relatives I only saw twice a year scattered across the lawn. He wasn't whispering. He never whispered. Elara's always been the liability in this family, he said to my cousin's husband, who was nodding along the way people do when they don't know what else to do. Heart's in the right place, maybe. Head? That's another story. I was 22. I was holding a red Solo cup with lemonade in it. I remember because my hand tightened around it so hard the plastic cracked, and the lemonade started seeping through my fingers, warm and sticky, and I just stood there and let it. Nobody said anything. My mother was inside. She always found something to do inside when my father started talking like that. I should explain who my father is because that matters. Retired Army. Colonel. 31 years of service, 2 deployments to the Gulf, 1 to Afghanistan. The kind of man who kept his boots polished even after he stopped having to. He had a picture of himself shaking hands with a 4-star general framed above the fireplace, and he referenced it more often than you'd think a person reasonably could. He had wanted a son. He had 2 daughters. My sister Nora handled it by becoming exactly the kind of woman he approved of. Married at 24 to a man in finance, lived 20 minutes away, called him every Sunday. I handled it by being me, which apparently was never quite right. I was the one who joined ROTC in college, thinking it would mean something to him. It didn't. He found things to critique at every turn. My posture, my PT scores, the way I saluted. Once, during my junior year, I got a letter from my program director saying I was being recommended for an early leadership position. I brought it home during Thanksgiving break. He read it, set it down on the kitchen counter and said, "Don't let it go to your head." Recommendations don't mean much until you actually do something. The letter sat on the counter all weekend. Nobody moved it. When I graduated and received my commission as a 2nd lieutenant, he came to the ceremony. He wore his old dress uniform, which technically he wasn't supposed to do, but nobody was going to tell a retired colonel that. He sat in the front row. When they called my name and I walked across that stage, I looked out into the crowd and found his face. He was looking at his program. My mother, though. She was a small woman. People always seemed surprised by how small she was, like they expected someone married to my father to take up more space. She didn't. She had this way of appearing in doorways without making any sound, and she'd just look at you, and you always felt like she could see through 3 walls and around 2 corners. She came to find me after the commissioning ceremony while my father was talking to someone he recognized from Fort Sill. She took my face in both her hands. This was a thing she did. She'd done it since I was small, and she looked at me for a long moment. "You are going to be remarkable," she said. Not for him. Not to prove anything, just because that's what you are. I laughed a little. "You don't know that." "I do," she said. And she said it the way you say something you have checked and double-checked and are absolutely certain of. Then she dropped her hands and smoothed the front of my jacket and said, "Now go find something to eat. The chicken at these things is always terrible, but you should eat anyway." She was like that. Profound! And then immediately practical. I think about her every single day. I was assigned to Fort Bragg, which is now Fort Liberty, but when I got there we still called it Bragg, and it was enormous and loud and nothing like I expected even though I had tried to expect everything. I was in military intelligence. I can't tell you much about the specifics of what I did, and that's not me being dramatic. There are things I signed my name to, agreements about what I can say and when. What I can tell you is that I was good at it. I learned to be quiet in rooms. I learned to listen past what people were saying to what they were almost saying. I learned to read a situation the way you read a map, looking for the elevation changes, the places where the terrain shifts without warning. There was a unit I worked with, starting in my 2nd year, that I also can't name directly. What I can say is that they had a reputation, and the reputation was earned, and working alongside them required a kind of precision that I found, and this might sound strange, genuinely peaceful. Everything had to be exactly right. There was no room for approximation. I understood that language completely. I did 3 rotations. 2 overseas, 1 domestic. Things happen during those rotations that I still process in pieces, sometimes in the middle of ordinary moments. Washing dishes, driving to the grocery store, waiting for coffee to brew. Somewhere along the way, I was given a name. Not my name. A different one. I didn't ask for it. You never ask for those. They appear, the way any nickname appears, from some moment that becomes shorthand for everything. Someone in the unit gave it to me after our second overseas rotation, and then other people started using it, and then it just was what it was. I was called Wraith. The reason for it isn't something I'll explain fully, because explaining it fully would require telling the parts of the story I keep private. What I'll say is that there was a night, in a situation that was moving faster than our planning had accounted for, when I made a series of calls that everyone in that building thought were impossible. Not dangerous impossible. Actually impossible. Like the math of it didn't work, and then it did work, and when it was over, everyone was accounted for, and I was the only one who hadn't fired a single shot. Someone said afterward, it's like she wasn't even there. Like a wraith. And then they looked at me and laughed and said, no offense. None taken. I left the service after 8 years. It wasn't a dramatic departure. I had done what I came to do. I was tired in a specific way that I recognized as a sign, and I trusted the sign. I came back to Oklahoma. My mother was sick by then, had been sick for a while, though she'd hidden the severity of it from everyone, including me, including my father, in a way that was so profoundly her that when I found out the full scope of it, I almost laughed through the crying. Of course she had. Of course she'd handled it quietly and without making a fuss and without asking anyone to rearrange their lives. I moved back into the house I'd grown up in, into my old bedroom with the faded comforter and the window that stuck when it rained. I took care of her. I drove her to appointments in Tulsa 3 times a week. I learned more about cancer staging and treatment protocols and medication interactions than I ever anticipated knowing. I cooked badly and she ate it anyway and didn't say anything critical, which was its own kind of love. My father was there technically. He was present in the house, but he was the kind of present that fills a room without contributing to it. He sat in his chair and watched news programs and occasionally made observations about the state of the country. And he did not ask me about my work or my service or the 8 years I had spent doing things he theoretically should have respected. Once, about 3 months after I moved back, I came home from her chemo appointment and he was in the kitchen making coffee. He looked at me standing in the doorway, still in my jacket, keys in my hand, and he said, "You should find a job while you're here. Sitting around isn't good for anyone." I had just driven 200 miles round trip. I looked at him for a moment and then I went upstairs and I closed my bedroom door without slamming it, which was the hardest thing I did that entire year. My mother passed in the spring. March, when Oklahoma is gray and tentative, not quite winter and not yet anything warmer. She went quietly because of course she did. In the hospital bed we'd rented for the downstairs room, with her hands folded and her face completely at rest. I stayed for the arrangements. I stayed for the reception afterward, where neighbors brought casseroles and my father stood in the living room and received condolences like a dignitary at a state function. He was good at that. Whatever he felt, and I believed he felt something, I have to believe that he kept it in a location I couldn't access. People came from everywhere. Old friends of hers from her church, women who had known her since before she married my father, teachers from the elementary school where she'd worked for 20 years. The house filled up in a way that felt like her, somehow warm and a little chaotic and completely welcoming. I was standing near the kitchen, refilling someone's coffee, when the front door opened and a group of men came in. There were 4 of them. Civilians now, you could tell. Not by anything obvious, but by the way they moved. That particular quality of awareness that doesn't leave you. They were in their 30s and 40s, clean-cut, not in uniform. They spoke to my father briefly near the door. My father's entire posture shifted when he saw them. He straightened in the specific way he only straightened for people he genuinely respected. I watched him shake hands with the one in front, a broad-shouldered man with close-cropped gray at his temples, and I saw something move across my father's face that I could only describe as reverence. "Garrison," my father said, "I didn't know you were in state." "We drove up from Texas when we heard," the man said. His voice was low and even, Mrs. Whitmore meant a lot to us. She always. He stopped. He had seen me. He went completely still. Not the stillness of someone pausing to think. The stillness of someone who has processed information and is now deciding how to respond to it. The other 3 men had gone still too. My father noticed. He turned to look at what they were looking at, which was me, standing in my mother's kitchen with a coffee pot in my hand. "That's my daughter," my father said, and there was in his voice that particular flatness that I knew meant he was about to add something. "She was in the service for a while. Intel." He said, "For a while," the way you'd say someone had tried to die at once. Garrison, that was the name he'd said, didn't respond to that. He was still looking at me. Then he walked across my mother's kitchen, which was maybe 12 feet, and it felt like it took a long time. He stopped in front of me. He said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "Are you Wraith?" The coffee pot was still in my hand. "Yeah," I said. He closed his eyes for just a second. Then he turned back to the room, to my father, to the other 3 men, and he said, not quietly at all, "Sir, do you know what your daughter did in Kandahar?" My father's face did something I had never seen it do. It went uncertain. He didn't answer. Garrison looked at him steadily and said, "She got 4 of my guys out of a situation that should have been unrecoverable. We'd been compromised. The whole operation was burning. She had about 6 minutes, and she had the wrong equipment, and 2 of our people were down." He paused. "She didn't hesitate, not for a second. She made calls that I still don't entirely understand technically, and she got us out clean." One of the other men said from across the room, "We called her Wraith because you'd never know she was there." And then, somehow, everything was different. The room was quiet. Not silent. There were still people talking at the edges, glasses clinking, the sound of the television my father always left on in the den. But in the kitchen, in that circle of us, it was quiet. My father was looking at me. I don't know what I expected. Some people have a moment of revelation and it changes everything. The camera zooms in and the music swells and the person who was wrong realizes it with tears in their eyes and everything is healed. That isn't what happened. What happened was that my father looked at me for a long time and then he looked away. He said to Garrison something polite about being glad they'd come. He shook hands again. He moved toward the other part of the room. And Garrison turned back to me and said, "Lo, you okay?" "Yes," I said. And then, because I wanted to say something true, I said, "She knew. My mom. She always knew." He nodded. "The best ones always do." I stayed in Oklahoma for another 2 months after the reception. I sorted my mother's things. I found in the bottom drawer of her dresser, underneath a layer of folded scarves, a manila envelope. Inside was every letter I had ever sent her from overseas. Every single one. She'd kept them in order by postmark, neatly arranged. There was something else in the envelope. A notecard in her handwriting. All it said was, "For when you need to remember you were always enough." I sat on the floor of her bedroom for a long time. I moved to Denver eventually. I work now in a field I find genuinely interesting, doing analysis in a way that draws on everything I learned without requiring me to be gone for months at a time. I have an apartment with good light and a neighbor who leaves fresh tomatoes from her garden outside my door in the summer. I run in the mornings. I have friends who knew me before the service and friends who knew me only after, and they're slowly learning to know each other. I went back to Oklahoma last Thanksgiving. My father was there. My sister Nora and her husband were there, their 2 kids running through the house with the specific energy of children who know they're loved and haven't yet learned to moderate it. It was loud. It was a lot. My father and I were in the kitchen at one point, just the 2 of us, while everything happened around us. He was pouring himself a glass of water. He didn't look at me. Then he said, "Garrison called me after. Last summer." I waited. Told me more of what happened over there. He set down the glass. Said you'd been recommended for something classified, said he wasn't allowed to say what. I didn't confirm or deny. Old habit. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't know." It was the closest he was ever going to get. I understood that. I had spent years wanting more than that, and then I had spent other years learning what more than that actually cost. And by now I understood that these 4 words from this man were all there was. "I know you didn't," I said. He picked up his glass. He went back into the other room. I stood in my mother's kitchen. It's still her kitchen to me, it always will be. And I put my hands on the edge of the counter and I looked out the window at the backyard where her rose bushes were still growing, overgrown now, spreading past the beds she'd kept them in. She had planted those roses the year I was born. I thought about the notecard in the envelope. For when you need to remember. Outside, one of Nora's kids started shrieking with laughter about something, and then the other one joined in. And then Nora herself started laughing too, and the sound of it filled the whole house. I took a breath. I let it out, and then I went back in to join my family. I've thought a lot about what my father said at that barbecue. Not because it still hurts the way it once did. It doesn't. Not exactly. But because I've come to understand something about the nature of what he did and what I did in response, and how those 2 things were always going to end up exactly where they ended. He called me a liability. And in doing so, he set something in motion that he didn't intend and couldn't predict. There's a principle I've watched play out in my own life and in the lives of people I've served alongside. What you dismiss doesn't disappear. It goes somewhere. Sometimes it goes quiet and dies, and that's a tragedy. But sometimes it goes inward. It finds the person who carries it, and it becomes fuel. Not rage, not spite. Something steadier than that. A decision, a direction, a reason to keep going on the days when going on is harder than it looks. I made that decision without naming it. I joined ROTC because I wanted to matter to my father. I'll be honest about that. The wanting was real, and I don't think there's anything wrong with admitting it. But somewhere along the way, the reason shifted. It stopped being about him. It became about what I found I was actually capable of when someone gave me a problem and trusted me to solve it. My mother understood that distinction. She was the one who pointed me toward myself, again and again, without making a production of it. She never said, "Forget about your father." She never told me to stop trying. She just kept redirecting my attention, gently, practically, with her hands on my face, toward the person I already was, rather than the person I already was, rather than the person I was trying to convince someone else to see. That is its own kind of wisdom, and it is not a small thing. It is, in fact, everything. What Garrison said in that kitchen didn't give me something I didn't have. I want to be clear about that. I had already done the work. I had already been in those rooms, made those calls, earned that name. His words didn't create anything. They just made visible what was already true. And my father had to stand there and receive that visibility, and whatever he felt in that moment is between him and himself. I've stopped needing to know what he felt. What I know is this: integrity builds quietly. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask for witnesses. You make the right call in the dark with the wrong equipment when the situation is moving faster than the plan. And you do it not because anyone is watching, but because it is the only call you can live with. That quality, whatever you want to name it, is not given to you. It is constructed, choice by choice, out of every moment you decided to keep going when stopping would have been easier. My mother left me a note card that said, "I was always enough." I think what she meant was, you were always this. Before the service, before the name, before any of it. The work didn't make you. It just showed you what was already there. I'm still learning to believe that. Some days I believe it fully. Other days I have to go back to the note card. But I keep going back. That's the part that matters.